Hello, I hope you're doing well and had a chance to read some good things in October. And if you want to let me know about what you've been reading recently in the comments below, I would love to hear about it. This is a casual chat about everything that I read over the past month. But first I want to discuss some fun bookish activities that I've been doing recently as well, because a lot of it relates directly to some of the reading that I've been doing. So I was invited to be a guest on a brand new book podcast that will be called The Ill-Read Millennial, and we discussed Iris Murdoch's novel The Black Prince. This podcast hasn't launched yet. I think Matt said he's planning to launch a number of episodes sometime in November, so hopefully soon it should be coming out. But I first read this novel a year ago, so I went back and reread long sections of it, especially the beginning and the end of the book, just to refamiliarize myself with its story. And I immediately recalled what a pleasure it is reading Iris Murdoch, and especially in this novel, how the central character is the kind of figure that I kind of love to hate, because he's quite a detestable person in a lot of ways, or unlikable person, because he's very self-absorbed and has high-minded ideals about creating literature. He doesn't just want to be a writer, he wants to be an artist. And so he has just recently retired, and he wants to write this great book. He's published one or two books in the past, but that haven't done very well. And so he wants to go to a remote location to write this great literary masterpiece, but he's continually held back by all of the people in his life that he's connected to, especially at the beginning, his one of his closest friends, who is a very successful novelist, but a popular novelist, who he kind of looks down on, and they have this great frenemy relationship. And so his friend calls him and says, "I think I killed my wife." And so he has to go over and attend to his friends, and so he keeps being held back from going to write this great book that he wants to write. And the situation and the relationships grow increasingly absurd, and he becomes kind of obsessed romantically with a much younger woman, and so we follow his kind of tragic story, and yeah. So Murdoch writes in such a witty way, but also, as she is, when she wrote this book, she had published several novels before, quite frequent. She was a very prolific author, and so I feel like with the relationships in this book between a very popular novelist and then a writer with lofty ideals, I feel like kind of Murdoch was kind of sorting out her own feelings, about being a writer, and how she wanted her books to be received, and this notion that if an author is very prolific, then their books must not be that good, although Murdoch's books are so consistently of very high quality, and but also such a pleasure to read, as well as being incredibly thoughtful and philosophical. So it was really wonderful to have a conversation about this book, but also to revisit this novel. Now, I also went to a really fun event at the British Library that was a discussion between the author Neil Bartlett and the biographer Peter Parker, because Peter Parker has edited the second volume of this anthology called Some Men in London, which gathers together lots of documents by and about gay men in the 60s in London, and so the idea is, by bringing all these documents into an anthology, it's reproducing what it was actually like at that time to be living through this. So it was a really fascinating discussion about this subject matter, and about looking through these documents, and a lot of the surprising things which came to light about how some men were really battling against the criminalization of the time against homosexuals, and how some other men were just sort of getting on with their lives, and might have had a domestic relationship that they had to keep sort of a bit quiet, but were just kind of carrying on with their lives. And so it was a great kind of portrait of the plurality of of homosexual experience in this time of from a number of decades ago, and how much has changed since then, but also in a way like how much hasn't changed. And Neil Bartlett is just such a wonderful writer. If you've not read any of his books, I'd really recommend reading him. He wrote a great novel called Skin Lane, and many other books of his that I read. So it was wonderful hearing them speak. And also the person who put together the event is a friend of mine, and because he wanted to stage the set like it was a London bedsit in the 1960s, I have this very old phone which doesn't actually work in my apartment here, and that my friend knew about, so he asked if he could borrow it to put it on the stage as a kind of set piece. And so it was fun seeing my phone up there on stage while this was going on. Anyway, I also spent a lot of time this past month not just reading, but seen a lot of films, because the London Film Festival happened in October, and my husband absolutely loves movies, and we go to movies like all the time, and so this is like his Christmas. And so over the course of, I think, 8 days, I saw around like 14 films, so quite a lot, and I'm not going to discuss them all, though I just want to, and some of them are book adaptations, so I want to discuss them in that context, but just to briefly point out some of my favorite films, because at film festivals like this, movies are shown that aren't often on general release yet, and they might not come out for another 2 or 3 or more months, and so it's really exciting to see, these films before they've come out to the general public. And one of my favorite films of the festival was We Live in Time, which is this kind of romance depicting a relationship between a man and a woman over a long period of time, and moving backwards and forwards in time to show, kind of piece together the story of their relationship, and is so poignant and beautiful. But I also loved watching the Mike Leigh's new film Hard Truths. That was so excellent. It's another kind of character that you'd love to hate, or at least in the beginning, because it's about a very difficult woman and how her family struggles to kind of cope with her because she is so difficult. But as the film goes on, it kind of shows a bit more her vulnerability and why she is this way. Also a movie called Sujo, a Mexican film about a boy who really struggles to escape the circumstances that he's born into in this kind of gain culture, and to go to school, and he learns a love of literature, and that was really beautiful. And also the new film Maria, about a kind of biographical film about the later life of Maria Callas, and it's played by Angelina Jolie. And of course, a really exciting thing about going to a film festival is seeing some of the directors and actors talking about their films. So I saw Angelina Jolie, talking about this, as well as the director discussing it. But then, I also saw some films that were kind of literary adaptations, and that of The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead has been adapted into a film. And because this is such a poignant and powerful story that's based on a real case of boys that were incarcerated in a Florida juvenile detention system, and how some of them were killed and buried, and were just kind of, and then it came to light a couple of decades ago how this had occurred, and when bodies were starting to be dug up, and so it follows two boys in particular and their story, and it was so impactful how this was filmed, because it was filmed using this technique of a first person perspective. So it's like you're in the perspective of the boy, watching as events unfolds around you, and so it really draws the viewer into that experience in a really powerful way, and it shifts between the perspectives of the two boys, so we are able to see them both at different points, but it's always from this first person point of view. And it just reminded me of what a powerful and excellent novel this is. I also saw a film called Layla, which has sort of bookish connections, in that it was directed by Amrou Al-Kadhi, who who wrote a wonderful memoir called Unicorn about their life as a Muslim drag queen, and this film Layla follows a character who is also a Muslim drag queen in London, and following that experience, how they live in a kind of collective of a group of like-minded individuals, but also has a romantic relationship with a gay man who is somewhat more straight-edged, and so the tension of that, but just looking at the complexity of queer life in London now, and I just thought that was so excellent. And I also saw a film adaptation of Queer by William S. Burroughs, which I also read. And so I'll talk more about this book because I want to talk about it in connection with some other books I read recently, and how the experience kind of overlaps with that, but it looks at it from a very different perspective. This was a really interesting film as well, starring Daniel Craig, and following a man who is living in a Mexican town and is financially independent, but also recovering from drug addiction, and develops a romantic obsession with a man who's sort of passing through this town, a younger man, and he follows that relationship, and it's interesting that the later part of the film goes someplace very different from where this novel goes, and so I thought that was really interesting. But also, they don't shy from showing the sexual encounters in the film adaptation, where William S. Burroughs kind of shied a bit from showing that experience whenever a sexual situation occurs. He just sort of shows the lead up to it, and then he says, and later they were enjoying a cigarette or something like that. Saw a lot of really great films, and really exciting films, and really exciting to be in that whole atmosphere of, like walking the red carpet and going to see these films and see the filmmakers and actors talking about all of them. But I saw not just film adaptations, but also a stage adaptation of a novel, because I saw a stage adaptation of Ali Smith's novel Autumn in the Park Theatre in North London. They're having a limited run of this, so here's the flyer for the show, and Ali Smith's writing isn't one that I would naturally think of as being kind of amenable to being adapted for the stage, but they gave a really interesting interpretation of this story using a minimal amount of actors and set. They had a really beautiful sort of backdrop to the set of these kind of autumnal leaves, and that was really lovely to see, but also used creative ways to sort of build the relationships and the sense of borders that Ali is writing about in her fiction, and how she wants to sort of break through these borders and ways of people limiting both themselves and their relationships, due to the kind of constructs of the society around them. And also, this adaptation was starring the actress Sophie Ward, who's also an author that I've interviewed here on my channel, and it was my first time seeing her acting in person, and so that was really excellent to see, and she did such a great job as the mother in this story, and just sort of fun to see this sort of crossover in literary worlds between Sophie Ward and Ali Smith in this way, and so since I'm talking about Ali Smith, I might as well talk about her new novel that I read. But I also want to point out that it's fun whenever Ali Smith signs my book. She also draws in a little animal. So this is a proof copy before Autumn was published, and I was lucky enough to go to an event where Ali Smith was talking about this for the first time, and the same thing happened with Gliff, where I went to an event where she was talking about it for the very first time, and in Gliff, she also drew a picture of a horse in here because a horse plays into this story where the horse is named Gliff by siblings that come upon this horse when the siblings are kind of in hiding in this kind of dystopian atmosphere where people are being increasingly like logged into kind of government system and being classified, and everyone is classified in a very definite way, and their mother has come into some trouble which they don't initially really understand, though we find out later what she got involved in and how she got into trouble. But yeah, it follows these siblings as they're kind of hiding out in this empty house waiting to be retrieved, and I really got into this story because I love the relationships that Ali Smith draws between her characters, both the relationships between the siblings, but also how one of them, the narrator, meets a much older, like eccentric lady who's very rebellious, and kind of the character that I just naturally love, and so it's so pleasurable like reading about their discussions and interactions with each other, and how naturally, like in a lot of Ali Smith's dialogue, just so much wordplay like comes out of how things are said, how words are misunderstood or misinterpreted, or there's like a play on words, and she just shows how like language just can open up this whole like breadth of experience and understanding, which isn't initially apparent, but also how it can be liberating to use language to not define ourselves in the way that people want to define and limit what we are, and the complexity of everything that we are. And so, yeah, I found a lot of the connections in this story really touching, but also it becomes quite thrilling finding out what happens to these siblings, and as it moves towards a future point, and what is occurring in this kind of dystopian society, and how they move towards a more hopeful point. So really enjoyed reading this, and I also went to see a couple of authors read in this past month, and discuss their work. So I saw Alan Hollinghurst talk about his new novel Our Evenings, which I haven't read yet, but I'm going to be reading this with my online book club in November, so I'll be starting it very soon. I'm very excited to do that. So if you want to join along with us, if you're not already a member of my book club, there's a link in the description below, so you can join along. But yeah, really fascinating hearing him discuss this new novel and his work in general, and especially how it was kind of good to hear him describe how, because this describes following a boy throughout a number of decades, and who is mixed race and who becomes an actor. And he's talked about how the first half of the novel really deals with his school life before then moving forward in time, and then the novel moves at a much more rapid pace. And he said he wrote it that way because he wants to kind of emulate the experience of when we're at school and when we're younger. It feels like time moves at a much slower pace, whereas later on, and I definitely experienced that in recent years, of how time starts to move very fast, and the years just start to go by. And so I've heard some people criticize this novel that it's kind of a bit slow in the beginning, but then so it's interesting to hear how Alan Hollinghurst thinks that's that he kind of intentionally did that for this reason. Now, whether that makes an actual good reading experience, that's a whole other question, and something that will be seen once I actually read this and start discussing it. But also kind of in preparation for reading this new novel, I read his much earlier novel, The Folding Star, this month, but I'll talk about that more in a minute, because I want to talk about that in connection with queer. But I also saw the Norwegian author Hanne Orstavik talk about her new novel Stay With Me, and that was such a fascinating discussion, and so I read this novel as well, and it was really wonderful meeting her and hearing her discuss her work, and how really like so much emotion and like her own life goes into her work, even though it isn't necessarily like strictly autobiographical. That, you know, it's definitely a novel, and these are, so like her previous novel Ti Amo, I mistakenly thought it was a memoir when I first read it, but then only realized afterwards that it was a novel, because the central figure of that is a novelist, as is the central figure of this new novel Stay With Me. And in a way, like sometimes with books, it feels like if there's a writer writing about an author, then it's like, it feels like slightly like too close to home, or like maybe, you know, slightly too like inward looking, I guess, by an author. But and I wasn't too sure about this at first and how it was being portrayed, because it shows an author who isn't named, who is writing a novel about a character who has just lost her husband, but also the author who is writing this novel has just lost someone very significant to her. But she is also engaging in a new relationship with a much younger man who is 17 years younger than her, called M. And they have a very passionate relationship, but also a very tumultuous one. And so as I was starting to read this, the narrative moves back and forwards between the author's perspective and then the novel she is writing. And I thought, oh, this may be like a bit too meta, and I don't really like understand the relationship between these things. But then as the story goes on, it developed a lot more poignancy as it is exploring how she is dealing with grief and with romance and feelings of not being loved, and how this connects with her earlier life, where she felt she wasn't loved by her family, and that wasn't something which was openly discussed. And she was actively fearful of her father. And so in this new relationship with M, he also becomes quite angry and aggressive in a way that kind of emulates what happened with her father. And it so it shows how like a lot of the relationships we build can be based on these early experiences in our lives. And so yeah, I found that really poignant as the novel goes on, and also things are revealed about their relationships. There are some scenes where the characters understand and get insight into each other's like psychological experience and how this impacts upon their own relationships. And so yeah, I found it really beautiful and moving novel overall. Now I want to discuss these two novels together, because they have this interesting connection, in that even though the styles in which they are written are very different from each other, subject matter wise, they have this interesting connection in that they follow central characters who are older gay men that develop romantic obsessions with younger men, but they have very different perspectives on this and go to very different places. So in Alan Hollinghurst, The Folding Star, it follows an Englishman named Edward who has moved to the continent to become an English teacher, and we follow him in the beginning months when he does this, and how he develops a romantic obsession and love for one of his students, and follows how his very intense sexual experiences and relationships, kind of cruising, but also going to the bar scene and meeting some men, and there's a lot of sexually explicit passages in this, which I even like found like, oh wow, he's going there, and but it's like brilliant how he writes about this, and he writes in such a beautiful way, and to really like portray this like atmosphere and the texture of feeling of the many scenes that he creates, but also he develops this real interest in this artist whose work is in a gallery, and the father of one of his other pupils is the manager of this gallery, and so he spends a lot of time in this gallery like observing this artwork by this artist who also had his own like romantic obsession and tragic relationship, and so even though he develops a relationship with another man while living there on the continent, he it just becomes obsessed with this boy, and it's all about this. And at first I wasn't sure, like, well, where is this story like really going, because it just seems to be all about this many sexual experiences that he's having. But then it gradually moves back to show his memories of the past, but also going back to England and at one point and sort of confronting his past and the complexities of his past, and how this is feeding into his present, and how he is someone that can develop such like a passion and obsession with beautiful things, but to actually love them and experience the full complexity of both life and love is something that is much more difficult for him. So it's a really fascinating story, and how it follows this, and really interesting to hear when Hollinghurst was talking about his new novel, Our Evenings, and one of the questions from the audience was, there's not a lot of sex or explicit scenes in this novel like there was early on in your work. And it was interesting hearing Hollinghurst's answer to that, in that he felt at the time when he was writing this kind of in the 90s, and he was starting to publish work, that he felt like it was much more important to portray the actual lives and experiences of gay men in this way. But also, naturally, as he's got older, he says, like, the libido isn't what it used to be, and so I'm just not as preoccupied with that as I was before. So that was really interesting to hear him talk about. But then also reading William S. Burroughs' novel Queer, which he first wrote, I think, in the 60s, but didn't actually publish until the 80s. And this is kind of a sequel to his novel Junkie, and shows the same character of Lee as Junkie. It was showing the actual experience of addiction, but this is more about the aftermath of, dealing with that addiction after going off using hard drugs, and how this filters more into Lee becoming obsessed with a younger man as a way of, and with sex in general, just like as a way of deflecting his own like getting through his own recovery process. And so it follows Lee as he is in this Mexican town, and he's just kind of drifting around, going from bar to bar, drinking a lot, and having conversations with some other gay men, but then also, kind of looking out for other men in this kind of like predatory way. And I found this quite frustrating to read, in that because Lee is just such a like listless person, and that he doesn't really have much like drive, or like the it was really difficult to empathize with him very much, because it feels like he's just kind of like living and getting by, and not really like progressing towards anything, because he's just hanging around in this town, just drinking a lot, and so I find that kind of listless character a bit difficult to connect with, and also like to understand his context and situation, like, because I haven't read Junkie, so I don't, maybe if I'd read that I would understand better how his character got to this place, but there's really no explanation given of why he's there, or what he's doing, or his situation in life. It's like mentioned at one point that he's financially independent, so he doesn't have to worry about work. He just goes to bars all the time and drinks, and becomes increasingly degraded in his behavior. But also, when he develops this romantic obsession, he also develops this kind of obsession with like mind control, and wanting to find a drug that can control somebody else's mind. And so he goes into the Amazon jungle and to try to find this drug and track down this drug, and takes this younger man with him, and it just feels kind of like worrying that this is that, like, he wants to like control this other man so much that he wants, it's almost like a Jeffrey Dahmer type situation. That's what it like felt like it was building up to, but it doesn't really culminate in that way. And the story just kind of fizzles out. It like doesn't really go anywhere in the way that the movie does go to a really interesting place. But there were some passages in this I found quite like powerful and interesting and insightful into his experience, but they were far too few. And so like overall, the book just felt really slight to me. And personally, like in general, I just never got along all that well with the beat writers of, I know it was a whole generation and movement and like style of writing that was very influential in a lot of ways, but yeah, it's one that I just don't really connect with or care all that much about. What I found much more interesting was the introduction, which is included in afterword in this edition of Queer that I have, where William Burroughs was reflecting on the experience of writing this book and talking about it in general, and that was fascinating. And I would have much more preferred this to be a memoir than a novel. It felt like it would have been more impactful that way. Now, looking at gay experience from yet another perspective, I read another novel called I Am Not Raymond Wallace by Sam Kenyon, and I read this with my in-person book group that I go to. That includes Bob the Booker, and so yeah, we had an interesting discussion about this novel, which follows a gay man who's English and who in the 60s he goes to America to become a reporter and a kind of investigative journalist, and is commissioned to write an article and do investigations into gay life in New York at that time. So he kind of enters the whole scene there, but also of course starts making self-discoveries. And the author does an interesting thing with the structure of this novel, that he follows the intensity of the relationship that he develops with a man in New York City, but then it leaps forward in time and follows subsequent generations of these men as they are looking back on the experiences of their father and their and the relationship that they had. This is like an interesting way of looking about gay life, again, from a different perspective, and reflecting on how life was, for men like 50 years ago as compared to today. But I felt like the first half of the novel worked much better to me and was much more cohesive, where it tried to go into the subsequent generations. It was, a bit more confused, and I felt less engaged by it. But it was, and there were some of the scenes and description of it felt like a bit cringe, but overall it was quite like an interesting novel to read. Now, to go into a completely different kind of reading experience, I want to talk about a nonfiction book that I read, or that's kind of part memoir and part nonfiction, of Smoke and Ashes by Amitav Ghosh, which is looking at both his life and his family's life, but also the history of the opium trade. And he starts out in a really interesting way in talking about how in growing up in India, he was aware that there was a lot of prejudice and opinions about the Chinese, and how these were kind of rooted in the history of trade of opium, or at least partly rooted in the history of trade in opium and relations, both political and economic relations between India and China, and but also looking at the history of the opium trade in general, and its connection with colonialism, and how that really fed into the massive profits, really drove a lot of colonialism in this way, and how and it's so fascinating how he looks at the poppy as a plant, which it's in its design to have addictive properties to it, because this means that it will be cultivated and will continue to spread. And so looking almost from the perspective of the plant itself, and how this is part of the plant's makeup, and how it's important to recognize this, because it's part of the plant that it will be so addictive in this way. And so we as humans are very susceptible to that, and which is a message which is very different from the corporations that and the pharmaceutical companies that cultivate this plant and market it as something which definitely relieves pain that people feel, but also has massive addictive qualities and negative consequences to it, which has in turn led to the opioid crisis of the past few decades that has grown and continues to grow, and so he explicitly references and discusses Patrick Radden Keefe's nonfiction book Empire of Pain, which looks at the history of the Sackler family and their involvement in the pharmaceutical industry, and one of the pharmaceutical companies directly connected to the opioid crisis and the struggle to hold people in positions of power and money to account for having caused so much widespread addiction, even though these companies will deny that. And it's part of the rhetoric that is involved in this that says that, oh, it's the addicts' faults for becoming addicted in this way and not being able to control themselves, when really, it's so much in the makeup of this plant, and a number of medical experts have agreed that it's really dangerous to be used in any form in this way, because it is so addictive and will lead to people wanting to have more of it, more than just to relieve their immediate pain, and so I found this really moving, and how this was like a process of discovery for him, looking at his own family history and his family's involvement in the trade, but also his preconceptions about it, having grown up in a certain context, but also how this fed into his own writing, because he is a novelist and wrote about the time before the Opium Wars, and so how this fed into a lot of his understanding of writing those books, but also of living in the world of that this is a crisis which is still continuing today, and that we ought to be aware of. Now, I've made separate videos talking about these final 3 books that I read in the past month, but I just wanted to discuss them briefly. So I read with my online book club Playground by Richard Powers, which I'm so glad we read this together as a group, because it really broadened my understanding of both the novel and the themes, but also the plot and where this story goes, because there's big twists towards the end of the book, which I won't give away, but which really change or force the reader to rethink about the everything that has come before, and so that was really interesting to discuss as a group, but also in general how this novel follows many different characters, and I think naturally as readers we feel attachment or interest into certain characters more than others, and so it was really interesting with the group hearing how they reacted to different characters, and I probably felt closest to the character of Evelyn, who is oceanographer and feels much more at home underwater than she does on land, and so I was really inspired to go to the London Aquarium because there's some beautiful passages in this about underwater life, and I was very proud of this picture of the book that I took while I went to the aquarium, of capturing a giant turtle, but also a bit of a manta ray while I was there, and so it's really wonderful to read this. I don't know if the entire book held together or worked for me at least as well as his novel Bewilderment, because I kind of realized I much prefer Richard Powers' writing when he's writing about characters in a concentrated way and has a small group of characters that he's writing about. So Bewilderment worked better for me personally than Playground or The Overstory, but I know some other readers felt the opposite way, and so really interesting to hear readers' reactions to this, but also how this novel deals with such big themes about the environmental crisis, but also the growing presence of AI in our culture and in our lives, and how that's really going to affect and steer our lives. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed that. And also Our London Lives by Christine Dwyer Hickey, which follows two Irish characters living in London over a period of, I think, 4 decades or so, and it moves backwards and forwards in time, showing their connections and relationship to each other. And they have a romance, but most of the time it's at a distance. But that's really not the central focus of the novel. It's really about how they are individuals in this city, this really large city, which is transforming around them. And while the city progresses and changes, they are kind of caught in their own experience and hampered in a way by their own personal pasts, but also aren't able to progress beyond the points that they get to in their lives. And so it's really interesting showing the transformation of the city itself. So one of the characters, he becomes very involved in the Airbnb business, and that becomes very profitable for him. But also he witnesses how the city is becoming more monotonous in a way, in that he's walking through the city and he's sort of lost in thought, but then he'll look up and he'll see a chain of restaurants, but then not be able to identify where he is, because this chain of restaurants and like fast food places there are many of them all over the city. So in a sense, he could be anywhere, and showing how the personality of some different sections of London and parts of the city are becoming lost in this kind of overall trend of like chains being the dominant thing, rather than individual places. Now, in my own experience, I think that there's kind of like give and take in this, and that I've definitely seen especially like Oxford Street in London, it's just a whole sweep of really like anonymous kind of stores and ones that are that you can find in many different places. But then there are also neighborhoods and I think like independent places which are and businesses which are growing up as well, and continuously opening, and so yeah, it's really interesting charting the relationship between these characters, but even more so their individual development as showing the real experience of living in a city and being part of a city for multiple decades, and witnessing the city changing around you. And finally, I read Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, this great big epic story, so richly plotted, so many layers to it, and I was continuously like surprised and delighted by this tale, like both by the story and the characters in it, many of whom are who are very engaging and endearing, especially the ones that are very difficult characters, and that I just found very funny to read about, but also the story, which at so many points I thought like, oh, okay, I think I understand everything that's going on now, I get it, but then there'll be a twist, and then suddenly things will be much more complicated than they appear at first, and then there are new mysteries that are introduced, and some of these mysteries I guessed what was going to happen, and then other parts of the mystery I didn't guess was going to happen, and so yeah, it's so consistently engaging in that way, and so was such a pleasure to read, and so much fun, like especially around the Halloween season, because there are lots of spooky and tense scenes as well, of like characters that'll be out late at night, and then they'll hear a noise and they'll be aware that someone's there but they can't see them, and so lots of really like it was really atmospheric, this novel, and such a pleasure to read. So those are all the books that I read, and a lot of the bookish experiences that I had over the past month. But I would love to hear if you've read any of these books, what you think of any of them, if you want to join me in reading our evenings this coming month with my online book club, that would be so wonderful. But I'd also love to hear about what you've been reading and doing the past month. Let's have a chat in the comments below, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.